Welcome everyone. I am Councillor Susie Horton. I'm the Cabinet Member for Children, Families and Education. Please be assured that we have put appropriate cleansing and social distance measures in place to ensure this meeting is undertaken in a COVID secure manner. This meeting is also being webcast to allow the public to view remotely if they so wish. Please be advised that the public seating areas not in view of the camera are used to webcast this meeting. A little bit of housekeeping. If the continuous fire alarm sounds, please evacuate the room and public gallery by the stairwells. Do not attempt to use the lifts. Please assemble at Queen Victoria's statue in front of the civic offices. In order to comply with the Guildhall Trust's fire marshal regulations, anyone who signed in at the Guildhall reception desk should sign out when leaving the building at the end of today's meeting. A bit about live web streaming. May I draw everyone's attention to the fact that this meeting will be live streamed. Everyone speaking will be on camera. Members of the press and public are also permitted to record the meeting on the understanding that it neither disrupts the meeting nor records those stating explicitly that they do not wish to be recorded. Please can everyone use the microphones and remember to switch them off when they have finished. So we will go to introductions.
Councillor Judith Smythe, Councillor for St Jude Ward, and our spokesman on this committee.
Councillor Terry Norton, and I'm the Conservative Party's spokesperson. Thank you.
Welcome.
Hello, I'm Angela Mann. I'm Finance Manager for Children, Families and Education.
Welcome, Angela.
Lisa Gallagher from Democratic Services.
Thank you. I think we should have Mike Stoneman, but he's running a little bit late, so when he comes in we'll get him to introduce himself. Okay, declarations of members' interests. We tend to have the same ones on this. I am the Vice Chair Governors at Craneswater Junior School.
Yes, I am employed at Mayfield School, albeit through an external agency.
I think that's it. Oh,
None at the moment from me.
None from you. Thank you, Councillor Smythe. Okay, so it's quite a short agenda today and all money. So we'll go to the first report, which is the school funding arrangements for 2022-2023. Over to Angela.
Thank you. This report updates the Cabinet Member on the latest developments in respect of future schools revenue funding arrangements for 2022-23. The government published the policy documents and guides for both mainstream and high needs funding in the summer, along with indicative funding allocations for 22-23. Based on October 2020 pupil numbers, Portsmouth is expected to see an increase in funding of approximately 5.7 million, which is detailed in Table 1. Section 5 sets out the changes to the mainstream school funding and how this will apply to schools. Portsmouth remains on the national funding formula values, and Appendix 1 sets out those values as published by the Department for Education. As in previous years, paragraph 5.10 sets out how the authority proposes to manage affordability should the final funding not cover the budget requirements. Section 6 of the report details the annual disapplication request to the Department for Education to disapply the minimum funding guarantee regulations to Charter Academy. In July 2021, the DfE published a national consultation where it sets out its proposals to move all schools to a hard national funding formula. Over the summer, the authority worked with Schools Forum members to develop a response, which was circulated to all schools for further comment in early September when they returned. This response to the consultation is included in Appendix 2. The remaining sections of the report provides a brief update on the high needs, central school services and early years blocks, and sets out that, as in previous years, further information regarding these budgets will be brought to the Cabinet Member in December. So the report asks Cabinet Member to approve the National Fair Funding Formula rates for primary and secondary schools as set out in Appendix 1, to implement the minimum funding guarantee of positive 0.5% to 2% as set out in paragraph 5.7, for the use of the minimum funding guarantee to manage affordability as set out in the report, and also to implement the disapplication request as set out in section 6. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Angela. I think people in the room are quite well rehearsed on this because of going to schools forum, but I think it would be quite appropriate to ask if there's any questions or comments. Councillor Terry Norton.
Yeah, one question very briefly, and it's just to bring me up to speed really. Can we, the protection, the MFG protection for ARC, what's the rationale behind that? It's one that I've forgotten about, so I'm trying to get my head around why that is protected for ARC, and is there any way out of it? Are we looking at that something that's that could potentially get to a state where they won't need that protection, or is it because of the deprivation in the area and what have you?
My understanding is that actually that we are working towards that, but Angela will be able to explain that in better finance terms than me, because it's historic, isn't it? It's to do with school expansion.
Thank you. Yeah, so originally schools were protected based on the actual value that they were getting and not per pupil numbers. And so when it came in, ARC had a large protection, but then it went to per pupils. The expansion of ARC meant that their pupil numbers increased, but they wouldn't need the whole of that protection anymore. So the disapplication request is to keep the protection that they had for the 600 pupils, but where they've expanded, the protection doesn't apply. And I think it is going to be the last year because everything else will have caught up with itself. But this disapplication is to protect ARC budgets as it's meant to, but it was to allow them to expand but not disproportionately give them more money, which would then take money from the other schools.
Thank you. Councillor Smythe.
I found the Appendix 2 on the Schools Forum response to the national consultation on fair funding very interesting and very informative, a few things I hadn't understood. What's the result of that? Has it all been received, and has there been a decision? And what was our response, if we know, at all in line with others?
So the deadline for submitting the response was 30th of September, so it's still early days, and I'm not sure that they've published when the responses will be coming back. We do have a forum for getting together with other local authorities, which my colleague Alison went to last week, so it might be that that they have talked about things then, but I can find out and let you know. We did ask, I personally asked a couple of people, whilst we were submitting to find out their views, and I think their interpretation was similar to ours, and I think people's responses might be different depending on whether they're actually following the national funding formula or not, because Portsmouth, is in a place of following it already, then it didn't mean that there was a lot of changes for us, but there was some technical changes as to whether to move mainstream schools in line with academies for their funding and things like that. But yeah, so the impact on Portsmouth schools wasn't as big as what it would have been if we weren't on the national funding. So I think it will depend on where each local authority is with that.
Thank you, Angela. I just want to echo what Councillor Smythe said. I don't know whether this is different, this appendix this year, but it did seem to be, Appendix 2, it did seem to be a clearer question by question outline. It might be that I don't remember it so clearly from previous years, but I too thought that it was very informative. And I guess it's a really positive thing that we made that effort to accelerate adherence to the fair funding formula, because it seems to have worked in our favour on that one. Okay. Councillor Terry Norton.
One more, if that's okay. So
Yeah.
I'm looking at the 780 million in the high needs block. So that's an increase of 8%. Do we have any indication of where that's likely to go? Is it, how we're going to use that additional 8%? Where will we see it in real terms, or are we not at that stage yet?
We'll be looking at the budget between now and when we come back in December to propose where we will be allocating the budget.
Thank you. That's good. So, just to say that I recommend I note the Department for Education's proposed changes to the school revenue funding arrangements for 2022-23 as set out in the report, and approve those proposals for implementing the local funding formula arrangements to implement the national funding formula rates for both primary and secondary, implement a minimum funding guarantee of at least 0.5% and up to 2% subject to affordability, and the method of managing affordability as set out in paragraph 510, and implementing the disapplication request as set out in section 6. Thank you very much. And I've just realised that I forgot to do apologies, so I'm going to go back to item 1 and just note that apologies have been received by Councillor Jeanette Smith and also Sally Hodges, who is the interim Director of Children's Services. Apologies, Lisa. So, moving on swiftly to the second report, which is the DSG, the Dedicated Schools Grant, Quarter 1 Budget Monitoring Report and Revised Budget, so to this year.
Thank you. So this is a regular quarterly report that updates Cabinet Member on the forecast position based on expenditure on the first quarter of the financial year 21-22. There's a number of budgets relating to funding of special schools, inclusion centres, alternative provision and early year settings that have been forecast to come on budget. This is normal for this period in the financial year because we're still waiting for class lists for the summer term. And so this is on schedule, but until we get them, we can't do an accurate forecast for them. Overall, the budget is forecast to underspend by £725,000, and this relates to funding for pupils with education, health and care plans in mainstream schools and out-of-city placements, the reasons for which are contained in the report. It should be noted that these forecasts are likely to change as we move into the new academic year and the funding is agreed for new placements. And we use a forecast for average placement costs until we actually know what each individual placement does cost. The report also sets out the changes made by the Department for Education regarding the timing of the adjustments to the early years block for 21-22. Due to the national lockdowns, the funding adjustment that we normally receive in July based on the January census will now be made in November and January following the receipt of a summer and autumn census. Due to the change in timing, it will not be possible to bring budget changes to Cabinet Member for approval before the end of the financial year. So it's therefore requested that the Cabinet Member delegates the authority to the Section 151 officer or their delegated deputy to agree that the budget changes are made to the early years block in line with our funding changes. It should also be noted that there's no change to the funding that will be received by the early years settings or the hourly rates paid due to this. Section 8 details of proposed ESG budget changes that we know. These are changes to locally paid high needs places at the special schools in the city. The inclusion of funding to support the turnaround project replacement is approved in the July 2021, and the increase in the budget supports increased numbers of early years pupils with complex needs. Therefore, the Cabinet Member is asked to note the forecast year budget outturn for the Dedicated Schools Grant, and together with the associated explanations in the report. It's also to approve the delegation to the Section 151 officer or their delegated representative to adjust the early years block budget in line with the allocation adjustments that we're expecting in November 2021 and January 2022. And finally, approve the budget revisions to the 21-22 budget as set out in Section 8 and Appendix 1 of the report. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Angela. I just want to say something first off. I get the fact that we won't receive the details of the early years and numbers until later, and I also understand the adjustments, financial adjustments. Are there any headline indications that that tail end of the pandemic will have the numbers will be significantly reduced, and could this have an impact on the viability of some early years settings?
Probably need Mike here to answer that question, but I can certainly take it.
Yeah, I will ask that later, because it all makes financial sense about what the government have done about the funding levels and about the delay to getting the final class lists, etc. But I was just thinking, if they come through and they are significantly lower, then that is obviously a cause for concern in some ways. So, on a kind of real live person level, I've been asking around some early years settings and also asking reception classes whether people are literally coming out of the woodwork and saying, my child missed early years because of the pandemic, but now I think they need to get to school. And there's some limited indication that actually all of that information around school enrolment and has may have been missed out a little bit. So I'd just be interested to see whether that was a result of the first year of the pandemic and whether it settled down. But we'll ask Mike if he doesn't make it to the meeting, then I'll ask that question and I'll circulate it to you. Do either of you have questions? Yeah.
I had a sort of related question really, it would be nice to have a sense of an overview of how much the pandemic particularly last year, affected the overall expenditure of this budget, and whether or not, as you said, there's any residual effects on this year's expenditure. We're halfway through the financial year. And also, just in a sense to reassure the public, there was you withdrew your question at full council yesterday, which was the right thing to do, but I wondered if any members of the public might have been made anxious by that question, and it would be good just to have a clarification from the chair. I know our financial regulations don't allow for underspend in one year's budget to be taken away, as it were, by other departments, but at the same time, just generally, these budgets are in better shape than they were 4 years ago. And I'd be interested to see that alongside the other budgets that we're overseeing, which are for children's social care, which I imagine show a different pattern of the effect of COVID. I just thought that some reassurance about the overall position and money being kept in the service for education and for social care could be given.
Can I make a suggestion on that, because it's a different budget?
It is.
So
it is.
this, I can reassure people, but rather than muddling this up, if we stick, because this is obviously the DSG, and what I will do is ensure that at the next meeting, when we will take that report about the portfolio budget, that we make sure that there's a clarity around that, just in case people were anxious about the papers that went out yesterday. But I think that's a really good point.
Okay, that sounds perfectly reasonable. I think, in future it might be useful if we could see them together, as it were, because there is a bit of a sense of us needing to look at the whole portfolio and put this in context. But thank you, I think that's a good solution.
I think Angela wants to come in there as well.
Apologies. We had a new corporate financial system that came in 1st of April, which meant that everything was really quite tight. So whilst we were able to get the DSG report finalised for this time, we weren't able to get the rest of it. And it's surprising how big the lead-in time is, unfortunately, as well, to prepare. So we were planning on bringing that to the next meeting. But because the timings are so tight as well, we won't have quite finished Q2 cycle by the time we meet again in December. But we do normally bring them together, but just because of the extra pressure that we had and sort of the tightness of everything, we just didn't have enough time to get the report ready for this meeting.
Fully understand that, and thank you. Is there any sense that we're in a lot of trouble with that, or do you think it's about right?
I think the sense is that the underspend last year will definitely be going towards this year's budget. Well, we'll get the details of it in the next meeting.
Thank you very much. That's what I'd sort of understood and what I would expect. And if I was a member of the public listening to this, I'd be quite reassured by that, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah, so on that, I mean, look, I think we're probably on similar wavelengths in terms of that. We went about it a different way. There certainly wasn't an intention for me to scaremonger or anything like that, but I think for me it's just about making sure that actually supporting you, Susie, and making sure that we do everything we can to support your argument if you are in a position at any point where you have to fight for funds in the portfolio. Which is why I guess on here, when I'm looking at the £700,000 there, the question that I think I need to ask then is a £700,000 underspend. We're saying that picture could change. What guarantees are there that not guarantees, what's the likelihood that it is going to, the demand is going to increase there and that we will spend that? Because I think my argument would be if we have got an underspend and we're looking like it's not going to change, then let's spend it. Let's put the EHICs out there. Let's do everything we can, because when we hear about CAMS waiting lists and things like that, I think if the money's there, let's spend it to stop it from going to cover a technical issue that covers a debt elsewhere. I mean, if I'm off the track there, then please do let me know.
I just think it's really important that we keep a sense of the two budgets, because they're really different. So it's not a case of if there's an underspend on this budget that it could be used on CAMS or it could be on something that would come under the different budget. They're two things. I mean, Angela will be able to explain it more clearly, but this is the DSG budget. If it does have an underspend, then there are clear rules and regulations about how it can be spent, and it can't just be transferred into the portfolio budget or the council budget.
Agreed. So Angela, so where the £700,000 there, I don't know what the actual figure was, where is that underspend at the moment?
So like Councillor Horton said, the dedicated schools grant, it's in 4 blocks, but there are regulations that we have to comply with, and it is ring-fenced from the rest of the council's funding, like some of the specialist grants are, but it is ring-fenced, so it can't be used for other normal local authority expenditure. So what happens if it has to look after itself in reality? So actually, if we do underspend this year on the high needs block, then actually we would roll it forward to the following year. We know the numbers of EHCPs, education, health and care plans are increasing, and they are needs based, and so their values change depending on the pupils it relates to. So next year we might actually spend more than the amount that we get in the year, but that underspend would be used to pay for that, and the council wouldn't be paying for any pressures that we're seeing in the dedicated schools grants. So it rolls forward. In terms of early years, if we had an underspend for early years, it'd really be because of activity, and actually our dedicated schools grant on the early years block would be reclaimed by the Department for Education, and that's our uncertainty at the moment. And we would normally know that figure in July, but because of using the other censuses, so an underspend on early years would generally be reclaimed. We don't keep that funding because it's very numbers led. But for the high needs, it would just get carried forward to the following year, and it would be spent on the purposes that the grant is intended for.
And the schools block, is that, what category does that come into? And is it spread evenly among all the schools, or is it focused in particular places?
So the schools block is what we distribute under the national fair formula funding values. So they're set. So it depends on the characteristics of the pupils at the defined periods of times that's set. So the council gets an overall amount awarded to it, and then when we get the information through for the schools, then that gets distributed. But we distribute all of that money out to the schools, and that's why what we get. They base the statistics on actually how Portsmouth gets funded, and actually the schools, there's a slight timing difference, so that's why we can't completely say at the moment what each school will get, but that's why we have some tolerances and way we have to deal with it, whether we actually get more than what we would normally distribute to the schools, which is why the lump sum for 21-22 was higher, because we actually had a bit more given to Portsmouth as a whole than what we could distribute by the formula values. Or, there might be, it might end up being slightly lower, and then we have to, than the 2% that we would do for minimum funding guarantee, but it will be between the positive 5% and the positive 2%. But all of that money just goes to the schools based on the pupil characteristics, and then if they've had a massive change in those pupil characteristics, and the formulas allow for protection, sort of what we've talked about with charter really, but so it works in similar sort of way, but yeah, it all gets distributed to the schools in standard ways, which is in the report. But it is hard to visualise that until we actually get the allocations.
So the formula interacts with the individual situations in schools, so that it's all spent according to that formula.
Yes.
Just quickly on your mention of the early years being slightly different. Presumably, that's why we were able to take that underspend and give those grants out last year.
Yes.
Yeah, because you don't want to carry it over, because that moment is moved, and it's a different landscape for those individuals.
Yes. So because we were allocated the funding and it's based on the January, then actually we knew we knew the adjustments really in the July, so it was sort of set, and the pupil numbers were then lower that we paid, so we were able to give the grant out, and we still had to allow for some of, because the January census also affects the financial year we're currently in, so then we had to allow for what that adjustment would be the following year for the previous year. So, but we were able to distribute all of that money because we knew there was a proportion that wouldn't be reclaimed back.
Brilliant, thank you. I think Councillor Norton wants to ask.
I was going to say, is that the figure on page 8 under early years complex needs inclusion, where we put 75,000 in earlier in the year?
That budget is to help children who have been identified as having extra needs, so they get extra support to try and help them and to give them the same opportunities as other people that don't have those needs, and to try and get them school ready, etc. So it's additional support than what a normal preschool setting would be able to give.
It's in the high needs block.
Yes, the high needs block does fund it because it's extra needs, so that's part of the rules that we follow. It gets funded, so it doesn't affect the hourly rates that we pay via the early years block. The high needs funding pays for that in addition.
It's probably a comment, really.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think for me, it's just, often it's trying to bridge the gap, isn't it, between a resident that says, I'm trying to get an EHIC for my child and I can't get through to this and what's happening there, and then seeing, £700,000 underspends, but it's understanding that so that then we can go back and be quite clear as to why that is, not give residents false hope and promise. If we, I guess any underspend in education is, should we be underspending in the current climate? But I guess it's hard to manage those funds, so I guess it's just about keeping it up, that desire to have as little underspend as possible, and if we are, able to increase the amount of EHICs that we're offering out or recruit in CAMS, that's down to us, I think, to manage that. It's trying to be as transparent as possible to residents, I think, who won't necessarily understand the ins and outs of it. That they might just see an underspend and think, well, hold on a minute, why am I waiting for something if there's a lot of money being underspent?
Funding is very specific, isn't it?
It is, and that's the thing. That's the point I guess I'm trying to make, is a desire to have as little underspend as possible.
And I think that's probably one of the reasons we work so closely with Schools Forum, and I deliberately tried to change the order of the meeting so that the decision-making meeting follows the Schools Forum's meeting, so I get a really clear indication, even though I don't participate in that meeting, about where schools are at, and I think they get this. I think if the people are concerned around referrals or assessments, then actually we do run a needs-led service, so actually that wouldn't be curtailed because of this funding here. So it is complicated. It took me years to get my head around all these different funding. So I think I'm sort of there now, but they're all very good points. And of course, I think what you're trying to say is we will try and make sure that money is not sitting in bank accounts. It's out there doing what we want it to be doing for the benefit of residents and children in Portsmouth, of course. Any other comments? Questions? No, in which case I will just say for this item, the DSG, Dedicated Schools Grant, Quarter 1 Budget Monitoring Report and Revised Budget, and note the forecast end budget position for the DSG as at the 30th of June 21, together with the associated explanations, and delegate to the Section 151 officer or their delegated representative the responsibility to adjust the early years block budget in line with the DSG allocation adjustments in November 2021 and January 2022. And finally, approve the revisions to the 21-22 budget as set out in Appendix 1 and Section 8. Thank you so much, Angela, for presenting those reports and asking our numerous questions. And thank you very much to my colleagues for coming today and asking those questions. And I think I take away an action to ask the question of Mike Stoneman about the early years, what will happen if those numbers are lower than we thought. And I will forward that on to you when I get a response. Yes, absolutely.
If people go out of business, clearly then they won't be there to provide
Yeah. We are very cognizant of the places that we need in early years. So absolutely. Thank you very much, everybody. Bit shorter than yesterday's meeting. Thank you.